that's what I was trying to do. I was trying very hard to get people to see how much more was out there than was obvious, because most of it isn't obvious. And I was hoping that by making people see how much history and culture was still out there, that they wouldn't regard it as just Cancer Alley or Plantation Parade. And I'm not sure that I was highly successful, but I spent over 20 years attempting to do this, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 70 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Well, this will be the final episode of 2025. I'm taking a break for the rest of the year, and we'll see what next year has to offer. If you're like me, you have probably driven some of the river road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and maybe you even were one of those folks who sort of hurried to get down to New Orleans and get through that industrial corridor as quickly as possible. Maybe you stopped at a plantation for a quick tour, and that's probably about all you really thought about that area. Well, Ann Sternberg has spent 20 plus years challenging the idea that the river road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is nothing more than rows of noxious chemical plants interspersed with those 19th century plantation houses. So in this episode, we dig deep into the past and present of that stretch. Ann begins by giving us a general orientation to the geography of the river road. What part of the Mississippi are we talking about? And describes the region's indigenous inhabitants. We then get into talking about some of the early Europeans who settled along the river there, including an influx of Germans in the early 1700s. We talk about the role of the Mississippi River in their daily lives, how they adapted to life along the river, how it was central to their movements from place to place, and a little bit about what agricultural products were key in the early development of that corridor. We talk about the Slave Revolt of 1811, which far too few people know anything about, and offer some ideas on where people can learn a little bit more about that tragic event, as well as which plantations really best incorporate the history of enslaved people into the stories they tell about that particular plantation. We touch a little bit on some other groups who've also lived in this corridor, including some Canary Islanders and Cajuns who settled in the region, as well as a Jewish community in Donaldsonville, where Ann has a good story where she was tracing the history of the synagogue in that particular town. We talk a little bit about the transition from agriculture to heavy industry, and then we finish with a few tips about getting the most from a visit along the river road, how to get away from just looking at the plantation houses only, or being in a hurry to get past the chemical plants. It's a fun conversation. She has a lot to offer, and I hope you'll stick around and listen to the whole thing. Thanks to all of you who continue to show me some love through Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can join that community, make me smile, and get early access to each of these episodes. Not a Patreon kind of person? Well, you can show me some love by buying me a coffee. Go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and at that site, you can learn how to buy me a coffee and feed my caffeine habit. At that same location, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll find all 69 previous episodes, as well as the show notes for each of those episodes and for this one as well. So take some time, go back and listen to each of those episodes, look at the pictures, and follow the links to find out more about the topics in each of those episodes. And now, on with the interview. Ann Sternberg has been a freelance writer and nonfiction author for 50 years. Her interests include Louisiana history and culture, natural history, the arts, foodways, and travel, as well as personal essays. She confesses to having been lucky to write about subjects that really interested her, from a week-long boat trip along the Peruvian Amazon to attending a rock concert with two of her children about 35 years ago, to a NewYorker.com feature about a Baton Rouge company that made dog treats from nutria meat, and much more. She's the author of Along the River Road Rambler, and River Road Rambler Returns, as well as Winding Through Time about Bayou Manchac, the historic bayou that was a distributary to the Mississippi River and once served as the international boundary between colonial Spain and England in the 18th century. Ann, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dean.
Why don't we start with a little orientation to the geography here? There may be some confusion when we talk about the River Road versus the Great River Road. So tell us where we are on the Mississippi when you think of the River Road. Where are we?
Colloquially, down here in South Louisiana, the River Road runs between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It's on both sides of the river. And that's, of course, as opposed to the Great River Road that starts all the way up, I guess, Minneapolis or so, and comes down and has a different profile altogether. Well, I'd say that they overlap down here a little.
Right. So I guess the River Road in Louisiana is also runs concurrently with the Great River Road through that area, but the Great River Road runs well beyond that stretch. Um,
The Great River Road actually isn't totally congruent here. I think it veers off in a few places, and our River Road, should say River Roads because it's a road on each side of the river, and it traces generally the base of the levee. And it doesn't really veer from the levee. It doesn't veer from the levee almost anywhere, except at Bonnie Carey, which is the spillway.
so it's a continuous pavement, but it's also not the same highway number for that entire length from Baton Rouge to New Orleans either, right?
Nope. No. Yes, I didn't know what that reflected about the Louisiana Highway Department, and I didn't think I wanted to find out.
So how did you get interested in this area?
Well, I grew up in New Orleans, and I've been living in Baton Rouge since 1968. So the area has just been kind of part of my neighborhood almost forever. Um, and when you live around here, the custom was if you had out of town guests, you take them on the river road and see plantation houses. And that's been true for, forever. In I don't know, 87, 88, I was doing a second edition on a Louisiana guidebook to Louisiana that was done by another regional publisher, not LSU Press, which has done my River Road stuff. And I was out at the Timber Mill Museum in Garyville, which was a little museum dedicated to the old cypress lumber industry that came in and decimated the old growth cypress here in the late 19th century. Anyway, and so the head of it was he was telling me, besides about his museum, all the things that were right around there that, of course, I'd never heard of. And a week or so later, I was having a conversation with somebody who was supposed to take a guest from New Orleans up the River Road who said, there's nothing on the River Road anymore. And it occurred to me that there was a huge gap between people who knew and people like us who didn't. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go find a book that connects these two people. So I went and looked, and I found a number of books about the area, but they were all highly focused on one thing or another. So I thought, well, there isn't a book that does what I want it to do. I'm a writer. I'll see if I can write the book. And so I went to the LSU Press with the idea, and they thought it had merit. So that's how it got started, and it led to 20 plus years of being out on the river and meeting people and learning things. And every time I went out, I learned something new, which just made the place richer and richer.
It's amazing like that when you the more time oftentimes when you take those opportunities to get to know a place and you dig a little bit and you dig a little bit more, it seems like you just keep striking gold with stories that maybe people have forgotten or maybe stories that not many people remember. It kind of sounds like that was your experience. Like the more you spent time there, the more stories you came across that you are now in the three books.
Well, yeah, originally too, the old timers, quote, quote, were still out there. And they were so delighted to share what they knew and to refer me to other people who knew things as well. And unfortunately, they're all pretty much gone now. So, it was a real gift to be able to talk to them and be able to have them as resources, for the first, certainly for the first edition of Along the River Road.
So let's kind of do a quick sort of romp through history of this area then. What do we know about the people who lived along this part of the Mississippi before Europeans came? Who lived there and who were the indigenous people of the area?
Well, there were several different, whether tribes or groups of Native Americans. When Iberville and Bienville came along in 1699 to do their exploration, they obviously met up with these people for the first time. In fact, it was um, the Bayou Gulas, I think, who told Iberville about Bayou Manchac, which was a shortcut back to the Gulf where they had left their boats. And, um, they probably never would have known about it. There is a little bit of residual Native American history still extant. There are a couple of Indian mounds. They're pretty much on private property. So unless you want to do what I did and trespass, it's not a good idea.
Which we don't recommend.
No, we absolutely do not. But this was in search of a story. So,
Mhm.
but then the French, of course, came along with the Iberville and Bienville, and then after that, um, you know, any number of settlements and layers of settlement were made, and you had the British in above Bayou Manchac, which would be up to Baton Rouge, at least along the River Road. The Spanish, Germans were down just above New Orleans. They sort of course, had slaves from Africa and from the West Indies, and then there were free people of color, and then Acadians came in, who were, from the Nova Scotia area fleeing persecution. Italians. I mean, it has a very rich mixed history of people. And so one of the things that started driving me was to present the area as so much more than just a plantation parade, an antebellum plantation parade, that this is a place. It's 100 miles on each side of the river, but all it has is mid-19th century mansions, 12 or 14 of them. And I just had so much more than that I just kept digging and finding and writing.
Absolutely. And a lot of the land that in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge um, was parceled out. I guess during the initial period of French colonial rule. Is that when most of those land grants would have been made?
Yeah, a lot of them were made. And, they grew into being the plantation properties. And they grew primarily, they started out growing indigo and rice, but once uh, the ability to mill sugar in a commercial way was discovered in, I think it was 1795. Don't hold me to that. But it, they started planting sugar and then milling sugar. And so a lot of the land along the river was sugar plantations, which of course were made by the Arpent Survey, which was French. And so the tracks were more narrow and long, and they went from the river. Your river frontage was what determined uh, how fancy a place you had, really, because having a broad river frontage was admirable. And then the land went all the way back into the swamp. So and it was planted in sugar, and there was, almost everywhere they had their own mill in the beginning and so forth.
That's if you've ever had a chance to see a map of, I forget what it was. It might have just been like a map of plantations and their
Yeah,
properties between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It
yeah.
shows that.
It's a
Um,
Persac map from 1858. Yeah,
yeah,
it's fascinating.
yeah. Can you just describe it real quickly what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, you've got the river coming down the middle, and then on both sides, you've got what looks like spines, and they all have names on them. And then there are little places that are maybe communities or little places, indication of, um, I think there's some indication on that map of places that steamboats could stop and get fuel. And I mean, it's, it's a terrific map. And there are very few originals left. You can find reproductions. I have a reproduction, which is not worth much, but I've seen the original, and it's just fabulous.
My understanding from about the at least part of the reason the properties were laid out that way, with that narrow but deep sort of design, is that it was a way to give everybody, all the landowners at least, access to the river. So is that your
Well, yeah, I
understanding
mean
too, or?
that was the point, of course, because the river was the source of transportation. There weren't really there weren't dependable roads because, of course, it rains around here so much, everything gets muddy, so you couldn't transport things in wagons or even on horseback much. But using the river, and until the levees were put up, the distributaries, which are all the small bayous that come off of the river from Baton Rouge south, um, up where you are, rivers come in as tributaries, but down here, because of the way the hydrology works, the intersecting waterways were distributaries in that they took water out rather than bringing water in. But it was a whole network, and they were used for transportation on the east side. There were that went, bayous that went back to the lakes where you could access New Orleans, and on the west side, Bayou Plaquemine, Bayou Lafourche, you go back into the Atchafalaya Basin and wend your way through all kinds of places. You can end up eventually in the Gulf.
It's hard for me to, I think, sometimes get my head around what that world would have been like at that point in time, the ecology of that area. I know that levee construction started pretty early, but water transportation and the benefits and curses of living around so much water. Yeah, there must have been many of those. What was it like living around all those different, waterways and bodies of water?
Um, it was part of their neighborhood. I mean, they needed the waterways. They not only used them for transportation, they used, they fish in the waterways and, I mean, it was a food source. I was in Sicily in April and went to see Mount Etna, and which had, of course, uh, caused all sorts of problems in the neighborhood any number of times, and said to the guide, why don't these people move? And they said they just think of the volcano as part of their neighborhood. And I think that's the way people thought of the Mississippi River. They knew it was going to overflow in the spring, which is why in the beginning they built their houses up so that the water would, flow under it. And they knew they needed the bayous and the intersecting waterways to transport goods. And it was just how things were,
It was just their world, right?
just their world. Yeah.
Um, Levee construction got going pretty early there too, then, right? So at some point they decided maybe there was a way to keep the water out more frequently, or
Yeah, apparently, from the earliest land grants, there was a stipulation about having to build some kind of a levee, but they wasn't uniform. You built the levee on your property, and the next guy built the levee on his. So it wasn't really until after the 27 flood that the uniform levee got built. And so now, of course, it's uh, a monumental structure that goes from below New Orleans way up.
it's I forget exactly what the levee heights are down there now, but it's almost like a three-story building, it seems like. I remember they're monumental structures.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, and frankly, down where we are, it's the only hill we have.
Right. So when the spring floods came, I guess houses were kind of elevated, so probably most years they could stay dry in their house. Did people tend to leave during flood season, or how did they deal with those patterns of those cycles of high water?
Well, I mean, a lot of the plantation owners had townhouses in New Orleans, and they may have gone to New Orleans. You know, no, the overflowing levee was always, I mean, the overflowing river was always a threat. And I read some stories because they built the levees higher and higher. It was just a question of, um, you know, how high can your slaves build your levee, and how are you going to protect your property? And then later, what are we going to do? And I don't honestly know what the people who lived there did other than stay very alert. And if the river was at its high point, um, there were sentinels that walked the levees just to see that there were no breaches. I mean, there's a place, well, there were crevasses, which of course is where the river breaks through the levee, and then forget it. Um, there's a street in St. John Parish on the east bank of the river, and it's called Crevasse Street. And if you follow it back a block or two, there's just a really nice pond back there. Well, the pond is the residual effect of the levee having broken and the water being all over this area in the mid 19th century. And it's that's that was I mean, that was one of my clue. I got a big kick out of um, all the places there were that had names, and if you just rode along, you wouldn't have a you would have no idea what it meant. Like Crevasse Street, I mean, but if you know, which was the point of what I did in Along the River Road, was to uh, disentangle some of these clues, expose what they meant. Um, and that was fun. Anyway, I'm digressing. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I love those little discoveries like that too. Like, most
Oh
people
yeah.
driving by a little pond would have probably not stopped to think for a minute. I wonder why that pond is there, or have any sense that it's there because of a levee break. Let's talk a little bit about some of the people then in this area. I mean, you kind of gave us a broad overview of the different sort of ethnic groups of folks who live there. Let me start with this because this term confused me for a long time, and maybe you can help clarify this for others too. What is the German coast? Tell us what that's about.
Well, the German coast was the area not too far above New Orleans, mainly on the West Bank, where the German settlers were congregated. And that was like the late 18th century. It's still referred to as the German coast, even though there's not much German about it. And in fact, behind the river road, back, I don't know, 5 miles, 10 miles or something, there's a big lake called Lac des Allemands, which is Lake of the Germans. And it's the Germans apparently were terrific farmers, and they would take their produce into New Orleans and sell it at the what has become the French market. Well, I guess it was then the French market. Um, and they would go down river on the river, but when they came back, they would have to come the long way through the lakes and across through one of the bayous because it was way too hard when you didn't have a motor to go back upstream. But they are credited honestly with, I think, um, being part of what rescued the early settlers in New Orleans, so that they
So it was their farming, their skill at farming that produced enough food that kept New Orleans going during some lean years, huh?
apparently, yeah.
About what point in time or what period of time did those German settlers come over? When did they begin settling along that part of the river? We're talking like mid 1700s or so, or
Okay, German settlers began arriving in 1720.
early.
Let's see. By 1746, the German coast is the second largest settlement in the colony after New Orleans. Yeah.
Are there place names along that part of the river that reflect that German heritage in any way? Or I mean, it's kind of funny. The lake you mentioned, it's German lake, but it's in French.
Well, yeah, because everything, I mean, despite the fact that the Spanish had the colony for a very long time, the French influence is much stronger. So, in a lot of instances, um, I mean, there's nothing much left of the German. I mean, I remember reading on the German names that got Frankified. Um,
Oh,
yeah, which was kind of amazing. And it was, just sort of one more thing.
right. I hadn't really thought about that, but I guess like probably many of those early German settlers over time, their last names began to take on more of a French sound to fit in with their neighbors. I think you also wrote a little bit about the 1811 Slave Revolt.
Yes.
I don't know a lot of people are outside of that part of Louisiana are familiar with the story. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Well, a lot of people in Louisiana weren't very familiar either until 2011 when they did a kind of shown a historic spotlight, and all of a sudden it became much better known than it had been before. The slaves on the East Bank in St. John and St. Charles parishes, which, as you know, is the same as counties. They divided things up by the Catholic Church in the beginning, and so it's never changed in terms of the name of that. They began an uprising and they marched down the river road attacking plantations. And fortunately or unfortunately, the militia in New Orleans rallied and came and defeated them all. And there was a trial. One of the trials was a Destrehan plantation. And of course, anybody that wasn't any of the slaves who weren't already killed were doomed. And they cut off the heads and put them on pikes and put them along the river road so that it would be as a warning to not have that happen again. And as a matter of fact, Destrehan Plantation itself has a really nice exhibit showing this and explaining it. So people, I think, don't know they're going to encounter that when they go to tour Destrehan Plantation. But it was the largest slave revolt, I think, in the country ever. Bigger than the John Brown.
Right, hundreds of slaves or enslaved
Correct.
people were involved in that, and I had a chance to visit that exhibit at Destrehan a couple of years ago, and I agree. I thought that was really fantastic, and I thought it told the story pretty well.
And it shows how the plantations along the river have adjusted their focus for a long time, and the complaints were absolutely valid. The plantations told the story of the people who lived in the big houses, and it somehow or another managed to skip right over the myriads of people who were doing the work. And in the last, I'd say, I don't know, 15 years, certainly, almost all of the plantation houses have incorporated the stories of both their slaves and then their tenant farmers as part of their, as part of their history. And so it's much more equitable and much more real.
So,
And
if you were a person interested in the history of African Americans along the River Road, then are there a couple of places in particular you would recommend that people should visit?
well, of course, the one place that's gotten a huge amount of publicity is the Whitney Plantation, which was transformed into a quote museum of slavery. Um, and that's a place to start. But any of the other plantations have pieces of this, specifically focused on their history. The River Road African American Museum in Donaldsonville does a good job of telling the story of slaves and African Americans and Blacks who have been in the area. And they've got some outbuildings that reflect cultural artifacts. Yeah, they do a good job. Evergreen Plantation has the only, at least along the river, and there are not many others in the South really. It's got the only collection of extant buildings from the 1850s. So they've got like 20 of the 22 original slave cabins that are in the back. And they did a huge job of kind of inventorying the population and collecting historic information and stories and finding families and descendants and things. But they are not currently open to the public. So they may be occasionally open, but they aren't open to the public anymore. So you can't access that.
Uh, so I remember when we toured Oak Alley, there's a collection of slave cabins kind of at the back of the property behind the mansion. From what I recall from this, the tour of the house itself, when we went around there, they didn't have much to say at all about the enslaved people on the plantation. But they had this separate area you could go and tour on your own. Kind of felt like they had split that part off from the main history, and maybe it was just guide specific. But is that kind of the way many
No.
plantations do it now,
How
or
long? No, how long ago did you do that? Do you remember?
I think it was just 2 years ago.
Oh, well, then maybe they've changed it because for a while it was, it was really kind of integrated into the tour. And and then Laura Plantation is another one that does a good job with that. Um, yeah, I mean, in Oak Alley's slave cabins, I think, are not original. Uh,
Right, I think that's right.
I think that they brought them in, but I mean that's good. I mean,
Right.
making the effort, and Oak Alley is certainly an impressive place.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystem supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold. Well, let's go through a couple of the other groups of people who came in there. I my history is right. So there was during Spanish rule, they encouraged migration from the Canary Islands into Louisiana, and there are communities of Isleños in different parts of Louisiana. I think there might have been an if I can say it, Isleño community kind of near or along the River Road. Am I remembering that
Yeah,
right?
it was right off the River Road along Bayou Lafourche. It wasn't big, and there isn't much left of it. I mean, it's an identifiable place. There's an Isleño museum. I assume it's still there, in a community south of New Orleans. Of course, I haven't been there in 30 years probably. It could have been blown away by a hurricane by now, but it was fascinating, the culture of the people from the Canary Islands and being there.
Right. Yeah, a lot of them were fishermen. Really, a lot of them made their living from the sea. So I was just sort of curious if I was remembering that right. So there is an old community there. Probably not much left for visitors to experience of Isleño
Right.
culture in that place.
Not along the River Road. I mean,
Right.
there may be some historical markers, but um,
And then Cajun community, the Acadians. Cajun country is a little further west. Maybe the heart of it is, right? But there is Cajun influence in places along the River Road too, if I recall.
right. And as you asked about the German coast, there are areas along the River Road called the Acadian coast. And um, the descendants are definitely still there. There are people who live along the river who have river Cajun accents, which is different than the Cajun accents you get over by Lafayette and out near there. There was a terrific little museum in Lutcher, which is in St. James Parish, that was put together by, there again, kind of the older folks who cared about what their old culture had been, was the St. James Parish Historical Society Museum. And they never had a curator and they never had a professional anybody come. And they just collected artifacts, and the people who knew what everything was because they had grown up with it were the ones who were in charge and who would tell you about it. And it was strictly River Cajun culture, the Acadian culture of that area. Unfortunately, they were on a piece of property that had been given them by the parish. The parish needed it back, or the city needed it back to expand the water treatment plant. And the papers and things were taken to Nicholls State University archives, but all of the other artifacts, I don't know where they went. And I was just absolutely sick that the parish hadn't protected this place, because it was one of the terrific little museums out along the River Road that were of the culture, of the various places. And
Wow, that is sad. I think you wrote about that in the book, but it sounded hopeful, like were
at
going to
that
build them a
point,
new
yes,
place. Yeah.
at that point, it was hopeful. After the book was published, unfortunately, and they quit worrying about it. And of course, the people who were still around to be involved were upset about it. I was upset about it. I actually was on a committee where that we were trying to figure out what to do with the artifacts, and the parish just never kicked in. So, yeah,
Wow.
buildings, and I mean, they had an old cistern. They had a great big log, I mean, huge cypress log from the logging industry. And the cistern, I mean, I remember once when I was there, this woman was giving a tour to a group of school children, and she was telling them that when she grew up, this was how her family got water. And it rained into the cistern, and then they went out and pulled a spigot, and that's where they got their running water. And well, not running water. Of course, these kids looked at her like, "Lady, are you crazy?" I mean, things like that.
Uh, well, that's a shame. Yeah, I was going to say, like, I need to put that on my list to visit the next time.
I wish
But
you could.
yeah, I
I
wish I
wish you
could.
could.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's hard especially for some of the smaller communities, it's hard to hang on to all the memories or relics from those periods of time. I remember you wrote an interesting story trying to look for traces of an old Jewish synagogue in a building in Donaldsonville. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. It is documented that the Ace Hardware store was the synagogue in Donaldsonville. Donaldsonville had a representative population of Jewish people. Um, and so they built the synagogue in the 1870s. And it was well attended until the 1940s, when there really were no more Jewish citizens in town to maintain it, and it was sold off. And but it's exactly the same building. It's just it has been somewhat renovated so that it was a store. And I talked to the owner. I mean, I had done some research, so I knew what the history was. But I talked to the owner, and he lived above the store, and he took me up to his living quarters. And the ceiling of the old synagogue was above him. I mean, it was this, kind of arched or peaked old wood, and he had taken up the floors from downstairs to use as his floors. So he had the old pine floors from the store. And I had talked to a elderly woman who had gone there, I guess, before it was shuttered. So she'd gone there in the maybe late 20s, early 30s. That was her synagogue. And she recalled for me what it looked like. And I got an artist to take her words and draw what it sounded like. And I showed it to her. And she said, that's exactly it. So I gave it to Ace Hardware along with a little history of the synagogue. And they have a double-sided poster and it's up in their window. And the last time I was down in Donaldsonville, it was still up in their window explaining what it was. And, you know, and there are architectural elements that if you know where to look are still there.
You
Um,
won't see any Hebrew lettering anywhere at this point, I imagine, though.
no, and I don't know that there was much there at that point either, other than,
Right.
you know, uh, anyway, but that was fun. And then the cemetery is still there. Um, yeah, I mean, the presence is noted.
Right. I did wander through the Jewish cemetery a few years ago when I was down there. I was, and it's a good reminder of the people who've lived in that area. I'm kind of, yeah, I don't know if there are many others like me, but I like wandering through cemeteries from time to time, even as a tourist, to get a sense of, looking at the names and the story. Sometimes there are short stories even on tombstones. It's a good way to get a sense of the people who've lived in that area. Are there other cemeteries kind of along the river road that you think would be an interesting experience for
Yeah,
visitors?
for people who like meandering cemeteries, the St. Charles Borromeo Church in, I guess, Destrehan has a very old cemetery, lots of old tombstones. Um, St. John in Edgard has a really old cemetery. The big Catholic Ascension Catholic Church in Donaldsonville has some terrific old tombs. Um, I mean, any of the churches that have any age on them have good cemeteries. The problem, of course, is you can wander through and not know who any of the people are. Um, so the old River Road names, Haydale, Becknell, whatever, and you can see that, and if you have a sense of who they were, you know, here lie they.
Yeah, right. You can kind of judge their material success at least by the size of their monuments, and
Sometimes, yes,
yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Um, we've kind of skipped past this part a little bit, but at some point in the fairly recent past, this area really transformed from primarily agricultural to heavy industry. Can you talk a little bit about that transition and what some of the major industries are that are along the stretch of the River Road now? The types of industries?
Um, Petrochemical, of course. You know, you didn't say it, so I will. Um, Most recently, the area has been referred to as Cancer Alley. Um, and it's because, of course, the toxicity of a lot of the products that are coming out of these various plants. And the fact that sometimes they're not as well regulated or monitored, perhaps. And most of the people who live around them are certainly poor, and many of them are Black. So until recently, there wasn't what they are calling now environmental justice. That said, you cannot argue that industry is new to the River Road because in the time of sugar, there was a mill at the back of almost all the plantations, and that was big industry of the 19th century. Sugar mills were, uh, and that's how you transformed the product in the field to something that people could use. And the petrochemical industry along the river probably started when Standard Oil came to Baton Rouge in 1909. They built a refinery in Baton Rouge in 1909 on the river. And then I can't remember who was the next refinery. It could have been Shell down in Norco, what is now Norco. But one of the reasons, of course, well, the main reason was the river, because you get barges coming down the river from north, and you get ocean-going vessels coming up the river from the Gulf, and they can go as far as Baton Rouge. So industry has access to markets all over the country and worldwide. And because the land was plantations, agricultural, Louisiana has this law about heirs having to divide the land equally. Anyway, families often sold off tracts of land rather than getting into a squabble about who didn't want it and who wanted to buy who out, and it wasn't going to work. And industry came in and they would buy them out for a nice price, and people would get rid of the land, and then the industry would use the land to build a plant.
Right. Probably was far easier for those families just to sell what they owned and split the profit or the dollar amount from that rather than trying to figure out who was paying who for that acre or half acre or yeah, I didn't think about that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So, um, I know that industry, and I mean, there are other things besides petroleum and chemical. Um, it being the river, I mean, there's all kinds of maritime businesses, and there I get places where there's aluminum ore. Um, and I mean, actually, coming along on the inside of the river is fascinating to see everything from the inside as opposed from the outside of the levee. Um, uh, and so there's a lot of industrial hardware into the river. I mean, in terms of, I don't know, what are those chutes and things to load and unload, and the petrochemical industry is certainly a big part of Louisiana's economy. But in recent years, there have been groups, kind of grassroots groups, that have grown up in these various areas to try and protect the people from overreach by the industries in terms of not monitoring what was happening, what is happening.
Hmm. Well, that's part of the dilemma I found when driving through this area. So let's kind of transition to offering some tips for people who are traveling through here. Um, there are a lot of places where you have the levee, between you and the river, so you may not see the river unless you go out of your way to get on top of the levee somehow, or when you're in a town and you're at a park next to the river. You've got all the private property from industry. I kind of understand why people focus on plantations because it's an easy thing to do and visit and an obvious thing to do when you're driving through this area. So what can visitors do to sort of get out of that mindset where the only thing to see and do are plantations? What else can people be looking for and experience?
Well, I will not argue with you. Um, Visually, lots of places seem derelict and there is nothing there. But that was the reason I did Along the River Road the way I did it, which was a similar format to the old WPA guides, where you set your odometer and you go along by miles, because there are still historic old buildings. They may look derelict, but they were a slave cabin or, at a specific plantation, or they were an old plantation store or something like that. Or, for instance, Crevasse Street. Um, there are all kinds of things. And so Along the River Road was written to explain what things are as you're driving along, or what things were, that make it a lot more interesting. That said, I cannot defend the fact that, that there are expanses of nothing. I mean, well, something, but nothing of historic or cultural interest. So I mean, you can tuck in and out of the River Road, because in certain areas, I mean, in St. James Parish, for instance, it's pretty dense with interesting sites.
Mm-hmm.
In St. Charles Parish, for instance, particularly on the West Bank, it's all pretty much petrochemical or other industry. And so if you only had a day to look at anything, you wouldn't target there. Donaldsonville, I think they're doing a better job now of explaining the town to visitors. But I mean, Donaldsonville is a fabulous old river town. And, I discovered so many things in Donaldsonville. And, I mean, people who lived around here said, really, in Donaldsonville? And yeah, really. Um, Plaquemine is another river town. Yeah, it just, you're right. On the face of it, you can ride and you just see an open field, or you see falling down houses, and you think, why does she think I want to be out here? And she thinks you want to be out there because they're hidden stories, and I'm digging them up for you so you don't have to, and trying to tell you that this is really a fascinating place. And it's not, I mean, look, it's not colonial Williamsburg. It's a real place, and it's changed, and you can go this year and something's gone that was there last year.
Like the Cajun Museum.
Yeah.
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 I will say I really enjoyed having your book with me when I was driving through that area along the river road. I felt like you helped make the invisible visible for me as I was traveling through.
That's what I was trying to do. I was trying very hard to get people to see how much more was out there than was obvious, because most of it isn't obvious. And I was hoping that by making people see how much history and culture was still out there, that they wouldn't regard it as just Cancer Alley or Plantation Parade. And I'm not sure that I was highly successful, but I spent over 20 years attempting to do this, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, good. And I completely agree with you on Donaldsonville too. I thought that was a cute little town. There was a lot more there to see than I expected. And Plaquemine, I felt the same way. I wish I'd had more time to poke around there. So there are definitely places to see and do things. I think what makes it a little challenging is that maybe you need that sort of curation or that help to know what to do if you're just driving through on your own without any reference or anything to help you out. I think you're going to miss a lot. And I think that's where your book really comes in handy to bring some of those stories out, but also to suggest places to visit that are still open that you could spend some time at. I'm mindful of the time, and I do want to touch
Okay.
on a couple more things. You mentioned in one of your books the Batcher era lands. Can you tell us a little bit what the Batcher is, and maybe give us an idea of a place or two that would be kind of fun for visitors to pop over and get a look at the Batcher?
All right. Well, in the upper river, I guess, since there's no levee, there's no real batcher. Batcher is the land that's between the toe of the levee and wherever the water is. So in high water, there's no batcher. Well, it's there, but it's covered. And in low water, the batcher offers many different things. I mean, in some places, of course, marine services are on the batcher. They're on the inside of the levee. One of the, and it's hard to go to a batcher because so much of the levee is privately owned. I'm trying to think. I mean, there are a few places where you can climb up the levee and go down on the batcher. Out by LSU, where there's a walking and biking trail on the top of the levee. And really down by New Orleans, although I think St. Charles Parish is the only one that's included in my book. I didn't, as you probably noticed, I did not go into the New Orleans area at all.
Right.
In terms of the books, because there's been so many wonderful books written about New Orleans that there was sort of no point, where there was much more point trying to bring attention to this area. But any place there is a trail on top of the levee that's public, you can go wander off. And I mean, in Baton Rouge, you can go down and there's a eagle's nest in a tree. The eagle will come back every year, and the tree is growing, on the batcher. In some places, the batcher look very much like they're wild, overgrown, all kinds of different trees and shrubs. And you could kind of wander through there thinking you're really out on a hike in the country somewhere. And then, of course, other parts of the batcher, as I said, are owned by plants or maritime services. And so it's full of machinery, equipment, structures.
If my memory is right and my geography is right, I think there was a really nice area of Batcher in front of Destrehan Plantation. There's a bike trail, I think, that passes on the other side of the road from the plantation, and then on the other side of that bike trail, there's a pretty broad Batcher area. I don't know how accessible all that is to walk around, but if nothing else, but I like the way you described it, and it's basically these little peaks into the old world of the Mississippi. These sort of natural areas that are left pretty much on their own. In some
Yeah,
places, they're pretty
some of them,
narrow, but
absolutely. Yeah. Evergreen had a swamp tour in their batcher some years back. They don't do it anymore, but their batcher was quite wide, and it had developed as a swamp. And there were alligators, the whole bit.
nice.
Yeah.
Well, I would be negligent if I didn't at least ask about food. It's a part of the country famous for good food. New Orleans gets plenty of coverage for its food. If you're driving along the river road, like I don't want to recommend specific restaurants. Restaurants come and go. I'm not interested in that. But just in terms of types of food, what can people expect to see if they just stop into local establishments in this part of the river?
Fried seafood, well, I will say, I was out cruising around one day and I pulled into a gas station where was I? Near Vacherie. And I don't know, the gas station was selling oyster poor boys, fried oyster poor boys.
Hmm.
So I bought a half of one. That was one of the best oyster poor boys I ever had. So I would say don't discount anywhere. May turn out to be terrible, but it could also turn out to be surprisingly good. And there's some restaurants. There's a restaurant in Lutcher that's in an old building by the railroad. The building's over 100 years old, and it does plate lunches and things, and it's very atmospheric. It's fun. I won't say the name of it because you don't want to advertise. Um, Hummus House has restaurants. Oak Alley. I mean, some of the plantations have restaurants, but the truth of the matter is, if you're just kind of wending your way along, when you stop for an attraction, ask the people who live around there, where should I go get something to eat? Where should I go get lunch? And they'll tell you, because you know.
People have their favorites, and the people who live there know best.
Well, and there are places that are of the place as opposed to being a chain restaurant on the airline highway or something.
Right. And even like the restaurants at the plantations tend to cater toward certain tastes, or they may be very good, but it's probably going to be a different experience than you pop into a place that's been there for 50 years and serves primarily a local crowd. So I'm
Right.
completely with you on the gas station food too. I remember when I was, especially when we were south of New Orleans and heading down toward Venice in that area, the po' boys we had at the gas stations were some of the best po' boys I had the whole trip. So don't discount that, those
Right.
as
Exactly.
options, right?
Exactly.
Well, Marianne, this has been a delight to talk to you. Fantastic to have you share your passion for this part of the river and the knowledge about the history and people of the area. If people are interested in keeping up with your work or finding out more about you, how would they best do that?
I have a website, which is mariannsternberg.com. And if they want the books, they're available on Amazon and also through the LSU Press. Barnes and Noble too, I think, actually online. Um,
Do you have any social media accounts, like you posting to Instagram or anything like that? Or
um, I gave that up.
yeah, it was probably wise.
I just, yes. So the answer to that is no.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And perhaps someday our paths will cross down along the river road somewhere.
I do hope so. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.